Imagine you're at your local Walmart, grabbing groceries in the morning, going about your day as you normally would. You head over to the checkout line and you're just lining up waiting to pay for your groceries. You're looking around and then you see someone and they look so familiar, but you just can't put your finger on where you know this person from. So you're thinking back to all the things that you've been watching and looking at and reading before. And then you realize the person that you've seen is wanted. He's currently being looked for by the police and he's just in the checkout line right beside you. What do you do? Do you immediately go to security? Do you do a double take and maybe just check that it's him just to be sure? Maybe you decide to put your head back down and go about your day and keep your mouth shut. And I honestly wouldn't blame you if you decided to do that. When Takesha Bryant sees a known murderer waiting in line at Walmart, she isn't quite sure what to do about it. Her son is with her, and obviously her priority is to keep her child safe. So she decides to stay calm, grabs her things, grabs her son's hand, and heads for the parking lot. But when she sees an officer in uniform standing outside the Walmart, she takes it as a sign that she just has to do something. So she takes a deep breath, squeezes her son's hand, and walks over to the officer. And of course, no one would deny that it's the right thing to do in a situation like this. This guy is clearly a danger to the public, but Takesha has no idea that this decision is going to backfire in the worst way possible. Hey guys, welcome back to another video. I hope you guys are all doing really well today. Now, I want to let you know before we get into it that today's case does have mentions of domestic violence and abuse against a pregnant woman. So if these are topics that are quite sensitive to you, just make sure that you guys are taking care of yourselves. Now, today we're looking at one of the most intense manhunts in Florida's recent history. I'm talking about car chases, public shootouts, a police ambush, and an entire month where the whole state was looking for one specific, very dangerous individual. But first, we're gonna have to go back in time to 2016 and start from the very beginning. Sade Dixon is a 24-year-old mother of two kids aged 2 and 8 years old at the time of this case. And she's living in Orlando, trying her best as a single mom to raise both of her children. She is not currently dating or married to any of their fathers. And it's not necessarily an easy position to be in, being a single mother, especially at her age, 24 years old and already has two kids. So she had them when they were quite young. But this is not to say that she wasn't a dedicated and passionate mother. She loved her kids and she was doing the best that she could at the time to give them a really stable and comfortable upbringing. It was clear to a lot of people that Sade was the type of person who was very determined, very good-willed. She was in the process of getting her real estate license, which clearly shows that she is actively trying to live a more stable life. And overall, she has a great relationship with her family. She has two brothers and she has an especially good relationship with her mom, Stephanie. Her mom even described Sade as someone who was a really strong, positive woman and wanted to retire us. And as all kids do, hopefully at some point in life, you wish or hope that you could just pay your parents back for all the good things that they've given to you growing up. And that's exactly what Sade wanted to do for her family. Now, we fast forward a little bit to late 2016. And at this point, Sade is now pregnant, expecting a third child. But this third child she's having is with a new man that she just met a couple of months ago, 3 months ago, just to be precise, and who's also 17 years older than her. And his name was Markeith Lloyd. Now, at this time, Markeith was actively working 4 different jobs. It seems like he was juggling a lot. He had a lot of things going on in his life, a lot to juggle. The fact that he was juggling all of these different kinds of jobs give us the impression that he really wanted to give his girlfriend and his possible new child the best life that he could. Now, their relationship moved pretty quickly. They were together for only 3 months before they decided to have a baby together. Now, it's unconfirmed whether this was by accident or if this was intentional, but they had first met on Facebook and their relationship moved pretty quickly, considering 3 months is not that long of a time to be with someone and have a baby with them. But nonetheless, it seemed like their relationship started off relatively stable. I mean, stable enough where Markeith had even met Sade's parents and had dinner with her family before. So he wasn't just some random man that her parents didn't know about. They had actually met him before and they weren't the biggest fans of him. They had their own reasons for that. that, but they, acknowledged that Sade was a fully grown woman. She was an adult living her own life, so they never wanted to interfere with that or step over a boundary. Now, the fact that Markeith was dating a woman 17 years younger than him was probably the least interesting thing about him. He had a really rough upbringing. He grew up in what was called a poisoned environment. He pretty much had to fend for himself as well as his siblings. He would oftentimes steal food from places such as bologna or bread just so him and his siblings had something to eat because his family was very, very poor. And his father was also extremely abusive to his mom. And not only that, he had a complicated relationship with his mother as well. She wasn't really around, not really a supportive maternal figure. He essentially had no parental guidance growing up, that by the time he was in third grade, so around 8 to 9 years old, he still couldn't read. And perhaps you could say that this is maybe the lack of educational support, but it seemed like he had a lot of developmental issues growing up. Now, not only did he have a really rough childhood where he was basically in survival mode constantly, stealing food and also giving money, any sort of scraps that he could put together, he would give to his mom so they could pay their bills. So it was pretty rough. But as he got older, he seemed to be getting into more and more trouble with law enforcement. So he actually has a really extensive criminal history and a long list of prior arrests. He has convictions for battery back in 1998. He was convicted of a felony assault against a police officer. He had also violently resisted arrest during this time. He was drug dealing by the time he was 16 years old. And by the time that he was dating Sade in 2016, and they were only together for that couple of months, he was not fully free from the system. He was actually actively on probation and under court supervision for cocaine possession. So it wasn't like he had served his time for 2 years, got out, tried to reestablish himself into society, started dating a younger woman. He was still kind of on the fence with things. And it's quite clear that he has, repeated involvement with the criminal justice system, which means that he is likely someone who would reoffend. Usually in cases like this, when someone has multiple convictions and they keep getting arrested again and again, it's like a clear pattern of behavior. Now, we know that he has a long criminal history, and Sade was fully aware of this too. There's not much to say in terms of what she thought about it, or she just decided to look past it. We will never know because we're not Sade, but nonetheless, they seem to still decide to be together. They were in a relationship for a couple of months, but it's quite clear that they're both two very different people in two very different stages in their life. Sade is younger than him by nearly 20 years. She already has 2 kids of her own with different men. And Markeith was in and out of the prison system. He has a lot of legal trouble. Age gap relationships, I'm not one to judge, but 20 years apart is quite a big gap. And sometimes these relationships can obviously work. But if the older partner has a tendency of being controlling and dominating, and not only that, has, a really long criminal history, a rough upbringing, this could perhaps create a really abusive dynamic. Now, Sade's family, like I had mentioned before, wasn't the biggest fan of him. But again, they respected the fact that Sade wanted to try and build a life of her own and was doing the best that she could with what she had during that time. Now, it wasn't just Sade's family that didn't like Markeith. I think over time, as they continued to be together, Markeith started showing his true colors. And over time, Sade realized that this was perhaps not a safe situation for her to be in. They would argue quite a lot. And, they had a lot of on and off periods, which you could say was normal for a lot of couples. What couple doesn't argue? But these arguments would escalate and sometimes get very physical. And that is not a normal thing when an argument gets violent and physical and aggressive. It seemed like a lot of the things that they would argue about was about infidelity and perhaps some cheating accusations that were being thrown around in the relationship. And overall, Markeith was just someone who was very possessive, very emotionally reactive, and just overall very controlling and dominating, not just over Sade, but over their entire relationship. And not only that, she's pregnant. At the time of this case, she was around nearly 2 months pregnant, so quite early into her pregnancy. But this, of course, adds another layer to their relationship. At this point, they're pretty much permanently tied to one another, whether or not they like it, whether or not Markeith actually wanted the baby. We don't really know, but we can only assume that Sade was trying to do the best that she could at the time. Now, on December 10th, Sade decided to move back in with her family, and she didn't fully explain everything to her family. All that she told them was that she and Markeith got into a really bad argument. Like, it was really, really bad. It was probably like the turning point where she realized, okay, this is not healthy or safe for me anymore. Like, we're over. We're breaking up. So she decided to move back in with her parents, and she had told them that allegedly one of the arguments that they had, it got very physical and violent to the point where Markeith bit her. Markeith had full on bit Sade to the point that she had to go to the hospital for her injuries and get a tetanus shot. Now, that's very serious. It's clear that this is a very abusive relationship. So this was like a turning point for her where she realizes, okay, I'm going to distance myself from this man. Clearly, he's, not the person I thought he was. She tried her best to make things work out with him since they were going to have a baby together, but she said, enough is enough. Now, a couple of days after she decided to move back in with her family on December 13th of 2016, Sade and her family were having what was a pretty normal family dinner. It was around 9 p.m. It was a normal night. It was quiet around the neighborhood. Everyone was in their homes. They're sat around the dinner table, her two brothers, and her mom and their dad. Everyone's aware of the fact that Sade and Markeith are not on good terms right now, and she probably does not want to see him. When they're having dinner, she suddenly gets a phone call, and when she picks up her phone, she sees that Markeith is calling her. So she decides to pick it up. She excuses herself from the table, and they get to talking, and then their conversation starts to escalate, and it becomes an argument. Now, it seems as they were arguing, Markeith admitted to sleeping with his ex-girlfriend, and this triggered Sade. She was very upset by this. They were already having a lot of problems, and whether or not they were actually together, it was just a really hurtful thing for him to do something like that so soon after them splitting up. And because of just how upset she was, it seemed like Markeith was concerned about it. So he went over to her house, kind of uninvited, pretty much just showed up out of the blue. When he arrived, he asked Sade to come out so they could have a conversation. So that's what she did. She left her family at the dinner table and went outside. Now, a little while later, a couple minutes pass, and one of Sade's brothers realize that she hasn't come back yet, and they can kind of hear them talking outside when suddenly their voices are starting to raise and things are starting to get really tense. They can't really hear what they're saying, but it's loud enough to the point where her brother is actually quite concerned and just wants to check up on his sister and make sure everything's okay. So he decides to walk over to the front door, and he opens it up, and very quickly, things escalate so fast. Before he knows it, he sees Markeith pulling out a gun and shooting his sister right in front of him. He does the best that he can to react in that moment. He tries to lunge forward and protect his sister, and eventually gets shot in the process as well. Now imagine, it's late at night, you're having a calm dinner with your family in a quiet neighborhood, and you just hear gunshots going off. Very quickly, her other brother and her mom hear what's happening, so they as well rush outside, and when they get outside, all they see is Sade and her brother on the floor covered in a pool of their own blood. And by the time they can even process what's going on, Markeith is gone. He's sprinting to his car. He is escaping and leaving the scene. But before just running away, he decides to turn around and shoot back at the house one last time. And during this process, Sade's second brother decides to push their mom back into the house so they can get some cover and they can be, out of the line of fire. And, that was just like his first reaction. Afterwards, Markeith runs away, and all that's left behind is just Sade and her brother bleeding out on the floor. Now, in situations like this, you are so powerless. There's not much you can do besides, trying to keep calm and think to yourself, first of all, call 911. You need emergency responders there straight away and get there as fast as possible. Put pressure on the wound, stop the bleeding. That's what you should do in situations like this, right? So that's what Sade's brother and mom does. They're panicking. They just feel so helpless. And very quickly, emergency responders arrive. And at this point, there's nothing much you can do. All you can do is just wait and hope and pray that your family members are okay. 2 out of the 5 people within the Dixon family were shot. And 4 of them were shot at. Luckily, Sade's mother and second brother did not get hurt. But at that point, the family watches what seemingly looks like their lifeless bodies get put into the ambulance as it drives away. At this point, the next course of action is to get into the car and trail the ambulance and go to the hospital. And the whole time you're just in the car covered in your siblings' blood, in your daughter's blood, thinking to yourself a million things, but also not thinking anything at all. There's no thoughts, but there's also so many thoughts. And you arrive and people are telling you all these things and you can't process anything. And then they tell you, Ronald, your son is in critical condition, but he is okay. All right. How about Sade? She's also pregnant, by the way, 2 months pregnant. Is she going to be okay? Unfortunately, she did not survive. 8 times. That's the amount of times Markeith shot Sade, his pregnant girlfriend, killing her and his unborn child in the process. What actually happened? What came over Markeith? How did an argument escalate so far to the point that he not only killed his girlfriend, shot her 8 times, but nearly killed her brother in the process too? What was essentially a normal family dinner turned into a scene of violence so quick and so fast. In a matter of seconds, what was essentially a normal family dinner turned into a scene of violence. And this horrible shooting happened outside of Sade's home, right in front of the house she grew up in with her family just inside, watching as her brother tried to protect her, but then ended up falling onto the ground with her as well and getting shot in the process. Now, after the shooting, investigation takes place very, very quickly. Luckily, there are a bunch of witnesses. Sade's second brother and her mom saw Markeith. They knew who he was. They don't know where he went. They don't know where he ran off to, but they have a witness account. So investigators are very quickly able to have a primary suspect in the shooting and killing of Sade Dixon. Now, at this point, detectives are trying to build their case as quickly as possible. Right now, the situation is that a young woman who is pregnant was shot and killed outside of her family home by her ex-boyfriend, who is now on the run. He's ditched the scene. He's gone in the wind. No one knows where he is or where he's going. All they know is that he's armed. He's dangerous, and he has a clear long list of a very violent criminal past. And not only that, as investigators are slowly uncovering more details about Sade and her relationship with him, they start to find out the domestic violence between them and his recent physical altercation between one another when he bit her. And all of this is coming to light. So it's starting to establish and show investigators that, again, there's a very clear pattern of escalating behavior. This is someone who is unhinged. This is someone who could possibly go out and hurt somebody else for whatever reason. Now, very quickly, the day after Sade got shot, they already had an arrest warrant for Markeith Lloyd for first-degree murder. But the problem is that they couldn't find him. They had no idea where he was, and he, for all they knew, could be somewhere completely else in Florida. But at this point, they knew that the killing of Sade Dixon was intentional. It was almost somewhat premeditated. 8 times she was shot. There's no reason for you to shoot someone 8 times unless it's some sort of personal or like emotional response to something. Maybe it was something that she said that triggered him. Not to say it's her fault. Obviously, he's very unhinged and unpredictable, but we can't speak to his mental thinking and mental state at the time. Now, very quickly, because of the gravity of the situation, this happened in a very small community where things like this don't really happen very often. Everyone was shocked when they found out about it. So the news spread quite fast, and law enforcement did make a public warning to everybody. There was pictures of Markeith Lloyd put up all over news channels, all over the media, urging and telling the public that if you see him, do not go near him, do not approach him. He is armed and he is dangerous. And at this point, everyone knew Markeith Lloyd's face. A day after the shooting, Sade's family spoke at a press conference that was held by law enforcement, and they publicly spoke out asking the community for help and just basically urging Markeith to turn himself in and face what he had done. Again, this family knew him. They had met him multiple times before. So for something like this to happen just like very suddenly and out of nowhere was just really shocking to them. And not only that, can you imagine going through all of that the night before and having someone in your family pass away so brutally and violently and still being able to get up in the spotlight the next day and talk publicly about the situation, like huge respect to her family. I can't imagine what that must have felt like, but in the situation, they have no choice. Right? They need to get justice for Sade. Now, at this point in the investigation, imagine weeks have passed at this point, and they're still actively looking for Markeith Lloyd. He's still on the run. He's still somewhere. They don't know where. And people have asked the community for help. If you see him, keep an eye out for him, but do not approach him. Report it in. Everyone was feeling really on edge about it. I mean, people were afraid to speak out. So it seems like even if someone were to see something, people were afraid to talk to the police. I mean, in a lot of communities, even today, this case was 10 years ago at this point in time, but even nowadays, some places in the world, people don't have a great relationship with the police and they don't always trust them. And you know, the motto, snitches get stitches, I mean, that still rings true today. So within the community, even though people were on edge, people were scared of Markeith, it seemed like people were also hesitant to come forward with information if they even had any. Now, this situation was so high profile and intense to the point that there was even a $100,000 reward for whoever was able to bring Markeith in. So even though people were very hesitant, you can see that there's a lot of incentive that is being given to the public just so anyone could have any sort of information about where he could possibly be. Now, crazily enough, it seems that Markeith did have ties in this community. He grew up there. He lived his whole life there. So it's safe to assume that he possibly had some help from people along the way. And he definitely was on the move quite a lot. He didn't really stay in one place for too long. He was bouncing from place to place. We're going to assume some people helped him along the way as well. Now, 4 weeks pass of law enforcement searching for Markeith, and he was able to stay hidden all that time until January 9th, 2017. It's very early in the morning, around 7 a.m. inside of a Walmart, and everyone is going about their day, getting their groceries, preparing for the day ahead of them. A woman named Takesha Bryant is also at the Walmart. She's just done her groceries. She's going to the checkout line, just waiting. She's there with her son, and she recognizes a face in the store. And she doesn't really know where she's seen him from, but he just looks so familiar. You know, when you see something and you have this sort of itch in the back of your head where you're like, I know where that's from, but I just can't put my finger on it. That was her. And then when she gave it a moment, she realized, oh, this is the man that I've been seeing all over the news. This is the man that they're looking for, the man who killed his pregnant girlfriend. She has all of these thoughts going on inside of her head. And crazily enough, guys, side note, Markeith Lloyd was apparently married to this woman's cousin, which is just super crazy and random and what a huge coincidence. But this was their first encounter in person. Obviously, at this point, Markeith didn't even know her, didn't even realize the fact that she had noticed him, but it was pretty much their first time seeing each other in person. Now, at this point, her heart is racing, her mind is racing, but she's trying to stay calm, trying to think about the best thing to do. She decides to walk out of the store, and as she does, she sees a police officer in the distance, also putting her groceries away in the car. So she heads over, and that police officer was named Deborah Clayton. And she goes up to Deborah and she says, "Ma'am, there's Markeith Lloyd in the store." And Deborah says, "Who?" And she responds with, "Y'all are looking out for him for murdering his pregnant girlfriend." And in that moment, that's all Deborah needed to hear to realize that that is the man that they have been looking for 4 weeks. He was right there in that same Walmart. Surveillance footage shows Markeith walking out of the store at around 7:17 a.m. And Deborah approaches Markeith with authority. She's stern with it. She goes up to him and she tells him, "Get down on the ground now." And it's very clear that she's a police officer. She's in uniform. She has her gun. But Markeith doesn't comply. He just looks at her. And instead of listening and getting down on the ground, he turns around and pulls out a gun and fires at her. Very quickly, the surrounding people take notice of what's going on and start scattering around like ants. Some people are taking cover. Some people are running away screaming. In the United States, people know what gunfire sounds like, which is just such an unfortunate thing to say, but shootings there is so common that people respond to it pretty much immediately when they hear the loud bangs that are echoing through the Walmart parking lot. This wasn't just one gunshot. This was multiple shots that were fired, loud bangs that echo through the Walmart parking lot. And the last radio transmission by Deborah was foot pursuit, followed by 3 gunshots, then silence. Just a couple of minutes later at 7:19 a.m., Orlando police receive a call that an officer was down. Deborah was shot 3 times, laying on the floor, bleeding out. And Markeith, he decides to walk over and shoot her once more. 4 shots. She was shot 4 times. Now, another witness, Monica Pridgeon, she saw the whole thing unfold. She saw Deborah and Markeith shooting at one another, Deborah falling over, and Markeith walking over and shooting her one more time in the chest to finish the job. When she sees this happen, she sprints over to Deborah's side. She said that her mom passed away somewhat recently to this, and when she saw Deborah fall, she just knew she had to be there by her side. At this point, she gets there. Deborah is still alive, but barely hanging on, slowly bleeding out. 2 officers rush over and ask Monica, "Where is he? Where is he?" And she points and says, "He's gone. He went to his car and is pretty much just ran away from the scene." Now, she says that Markeith could have fled after shooting Deborah, but he chose to turn around and kill her. He wanted to finish her off. At this point, Monica and the other officers stay by Deborah's side in her final moments up until her last breath, as Markeith just flees the scene. Now, after Markeith shot and killed Deborah and left her laying bleeding out on the Walmart parking lot, he very quickly runs to his car and drives off as fast as possible. Now, law enforcement respond to this situation pretty much immediately, and as he's fleeing, he starts encountering a lot of responding deputies, and basically a huge car chase ensues. Not only are people who are chasing him at risk of, accidents happening or gunfire being exchanged, as police and Markeith were actively shooting each other during the car chase, other civilians and people on the road are at risk too. And throughout all of the chaos, Markeith was able to lose them for a slight moment while he was being chased, got out of his vehicle, and then decided to carjack another vehicle at gunpoint. And luckily, that individual did not get harmed throughout the process, but his car got stolen, so that kind of sucks. And then Markeith took his vehicle and just escaped and basically went off into the wind. He was nowhere to be seen again for a good while. Now, this manhunt pretty much reaches its peak intensity at this moment. Not only was he on the run for 4 weeks and actively being looked for killing his pregnant girlfriend, he's now just killed a police officer, and a bunch of people saw it go down. At this point, this becomes one of the largest manhunts in this region at that time. The killing of a police officer quickly brings this situation to national attention on top of what was already a really intense scene. Florida's governor also publicly condemned the attack, and all law enforcement in Orlando was pretty much actively searching for Markeith. This was a huge search effort. Deborah Clayton, she was a master sergeant. She was a lieutenant within the Orlando Police Department with 17 years of experience behind her. She was a veteran within her department. She was highly respected, really experienced within her field, super involved within her community. So when people found out that she was shot and killed during all of this, people were devastated. What a lot of people don't know is that Deborah wasn't the only officer who was killed during this manhunt. During the car chase for Markeith, when things were just so chaotic and everything was all over the place, there was another tragedy. Norman Lewis, a Orange County deputy, was killed in a motorcycle crash, and he was responding to the situation as well and trying to help out, doing his active duty. And he wasn't directly killed by Markeith, but it happened because of the ongoing manhunt for Markeith. So there it is again, another death that Markeith is essentially responsible for. So now the Orlando Police Department is not only dealing with the loss of one of their own, but 2 police officers got killed in this process. And there's an active shooter that's still on the run. Morale is completely shaken, but the focus is very clear. Now it's kind of personal for police. Find Markeith Lloyd as quickly as possible. On January 17th, after a week of Markeith being on the run after killing Deborah Clayton, law enforcement were able to finally track him down, and they found him hiding out in an abandoned house in Carver Shores neighborhood, which is a pretty residential, family oriented neighborhood. So this was like a high risk operation. They really wanted to make sure there'd be no other casualties and having other civilians get harmed in the process. So when they were able to pinpoint his location, they very quickly set up a perimeter around the house. Now, just to emphasize the full gravity of the situation, this wasn't just like a couple of police officers that were there, like, 2 or 5. There was over 20 people on scene, like in tactical gear, all ready to essentially barge into this house. But they didn't barge into the house because, of course, that would put their lives at risk as well as Markeith's life. And they needed to do whatever they could to bring him in alive and arrest him. Even though it was personal for them and a lot of people were very emotionally invested in the situation, they still had to follow the law and there was still due process. So at this point, there was a perimeter established around the abandoned house, and law enforcement are prepared for a potential confrontation. They know that he's armed within that house and that there could be a potential standoff. They're there for quite some time, like a long period of time passes, like hours and hours. It's too high risk for them to barge in. So they try to communicate with him. They negotiate his surrender. Tension is really high during this moment. No one knows what to anticipate next. Now, at this point, Markeith is surrounded. He's in that house with 2 guns by his side, knowing he can either run out of that house, guns blazing, try to negotiate something, or just surrender. But he decides to take another option. He sees that at the back of the property that he was at had like kind of a back door that he think he could have, escaped to, because even though they did set up a perimeter, I think in his mind, he thought like, this is the best chance I'm going to get. I'm not going to go out the front door. I'm going out from the back. But as he tried to, the police were already there waiting for him, and very quickly, put your hands up. Hands are up, and he gave up his weapons immediately and surrendered with his face down on the ground. And very quickly, this huge crowd of police officers come in and arrest him and take him into custody. Finally, after nearly what was 5 weeks of searching for this man, he is finally arrested. And it's a little bit poetic. They used Deborah Clayton's handcuffs to arrest him as well. Now, during Markeith's arrest, something a little bit controversial happened. There were some officers who used a significant amount of force while subduing him. He was beaten and kicked multiple times throughout this process. He was struck multiple times in the face when he was taken into custody. And as a result, he had really bad facial injuries and he actually lost his right eye. He was able to seek medical treatment very quickly after this. Like, they brought him to the hospital and obviously did their due diligence. But there is footage from, news outlets that captured the moment he was arrested and being brought into the police station. And he has this huge bandage wrapped around his head, like just kind of soaked in blood. Like, it is pretty grim and it looked like he got beat pretty badly. Now, from the police's perspective, they were dealing with someone who had killed a pregnant woman, and not just any pregnant woman, which is already really like an evil thing to do. He killed his own girlfriend that was carrying his unborn child. He essentially killed his own child. And not only that, he killed a police officer, which is an incredibly serious offense and very personal for a lot of the people who were on the force. And he had fired at deputies multiple times. Another person got killed in the crossfire, and he had been on the run for weeks. So even though this was quite controversial, a lot of different people had a lot of different thoughts and opinions on the fact that he was, quite aggressively arrested. Some people said, oh, he deserved it. Other people said, like, no matter how personal it may have felt for the police officers, it's not the right thing for them to do. If you guys have thoughts about that, let me know in the comment section down below. But nonetheless, this kind of controversy of how he was arrested will play an important part later on within his trial. The murder for Sade Dixon took place in October 25th, 2019. So a couple years have passed at this point while the family was waiting for some closure. And throughout this time, after 1 year of Sade's passing, they did hold a really special vigil for her. A lot of people in the community attended it. They had posters that they made of her, and they've really dedicated this time to just remember Sade for not just what happened to her, but also for who she was. Now, during this time, Markeith was in custody while awaiting this trial, and the prosecutors were seeking the death penalty. They argued that Markeith had several chances to leave the altercation between him and Sade that happened in front of her family's home, but instead he decided to raise his gun and shoot her not once, not twice, but multiple times and effectively killing her and her kid. There was a quote from the assistant state's attorney, Rich Buxman, that told jurors all of this could have been avoided if the defendant just left like he was told, but instead he was going to finish what he started. And doesn't this seem somewhat similar to another scenario where he had an opportunity to walk away, but decided to walk back and finish someone off? So they argued that it's clear that he meant to do this. It was done with intention. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't self-defense. This is what the prosecution argued. Markeith's defense team, one of his attorneys, Terrence Lenneman, argued that his client was just defending himself. Now, this is Markeith's claim as to what happened that night. He did eventually take the stand and testify during his own trial. He said that him and Sade argued that night, as we know, and that he had told her that he slept with an ex-girlfriend and that she got really upset about it. And as a way to try to reconcile and make up for the situation, he decided to go over to her house. He claimed that Sade had told him, "I'm glad you had fun going out to eat. Now I know, don't expect no baby." And Markeith pretty much thought that when she said that she was going to do something to the baby, like kill the baby or get an abortion. This was his claim. And then he said the situation escalated from there, where Sade pretty much went back inside of the house to grab a gun, and she came out with it. And during that moment, he felt so threatened that he felt the need to pretty much shoot her. And not just shoot her brother as well, because he was apparently also coming at Markeith and he felt threatened for his life. Now, there's a lot of things here that really don't make sense to us, right? Like, we're listening to the fact that he's saying that he was worried about the fact that his girlfriend was going to effectively kill his baby or get an abortion, and he ends up killing her by shooting her 4 times anyways. So, that was probably something that a lot of people were questioning when they heard this claim. Like, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Sade's brother, Ronald, the same brother that tried to step in and help her and effectively got shot in the process and was also in critical condition, did take the stand, and he testified that his order of events was he heard them arguing, so he went outside to try and defuse the situation, like as a brother would try and help out his big sister. And Markeith claimed in rebuttal that Ronald at this moment attacked him, and that is what provoked him to shoot, that he was in fear for his life. And he said, and I quote, "I was in defense mode. I went in warrior mode, and I was just reacting. Everything happened just like that." Now, people have some thoughts about this because his wording is very interesting here. He's claiming self-defense against a pregnant woman who apparently had a gun, only according to Markeith, and shot her multiple times, as well as her brother, putting him in critical condition and effectively killing her while he pretty much walked away unscathed. Now, his use of wording here is interesting. Warrior mode. It almost sounds like he views himself as somebody who was fighting for their life against these huge threats, and oh my God, it was so scary for him. Let's be so for real here, right? He killed a pregnant woman. Now, when Markeith took the stand, it lasted around 5 hours, his testimony. And at one point, him and his attorney even role-played the events that occurred that night to try to display to the jury that he was in fact defending himself and kind of portraying Ronald as someone who is the aggressor, as well as Sade, kind of coming at him verbally. And Markeith had said, "I wanted my child. I never meant to kill my queen." Now, they tried their best to give a good defense and play off the self-defense card. But Markeith Lloyd was found guilty of first-degree murder, and he did receive life in prison with no parole. Now, even though the prosecution was seeking the death penalty, for that type of conviction, the jury must agree upon it unanimously. And the 12-person jury, they deliberated all afternoon. It took them 5 hours to reach a verdict, and they voted against the death penalty. We won't fully understand their reasoning or why this is. It seems that the defense was really trying to play Markeith as someone who was defending himself, kind of mentally unstable, somewhat mentally insane at the time, and that these factors influenced his decision to respond to the situation in such a brutal and aggressive way. But this wasn't enough to convince the jury. Nonetheless, after this, Markeith was pretty much sent to prison, and he stayed there in custody up until around May 2021, where he was going to stand trial again for the murder of Deborah Clayton as well in Orlando, Florida. Now, prosecutors, again, they were seeking the death penalty. They really did not want him to have life in prison. They were very adamant about this. And this was mostly due to the severity of the crime. I mean, he killed a police officer and he has a really long, clear history of violence and being involved within the criminal justice system. So the prosecution presented a really visually compelling case. It was really hard for the jury to take their eyes off of it because the prosecution had surveillance footage of that day where the shooting against Deborah Clayton happened, where you can literally see Mark Keith walking out of the Walmart and the whole scene unfolding right before them. And this really hit close to home because it's one thing about hearing about a situation, but to sort of see it firsthand, even though they weren't there in person, but to see it through footage, it really struck them in an emotional way. And it was a very powerful play on the prosecution side. Now, Markeith's defense team decided to take the approach of not trying to deny his involvement because it's impossible to do so when there's clear surveillance footage of him literally shooting a police officer, as well as multiple eyewitnesses that saw the whole thing go down. They instead wanted to claim self-defense yet again. Even though the evidence was very overwhelming, they tried their best. They said that during the time of the Walmart shooting, at this point, Markeith had been on the run for weeks. He was under intense pressure. He was going through isolation. He didn't have any support system and no one by his side. And this led to increased paranoia. And because of this mental instability and this prolonged mental deterioration, their justification was that it essentially put him into a really intense fight or flight mode, which led him to act in this way, essentially creating this huge chaos and killing somebody. That was pretty much their defense. And they also brought up the fact that his background and life circumstances weren't in his favor. He had an incredibly rough upbringing, very unstable early life, no parental figures or support whatsoever. And he started drug dealing from a very young age, which pretty much put him into the system. And they try to use this as a way to humanize him. And not only that, they brought up the fact that he was also injured during his arrest. During the time of this trial, you can see that Markeith has lost his eye. And even then, while he was being brought into custody, he had a huge bandage across his face, like I said before. And a lot of people saw this. This was like all over the media. And they use this as a way to try to humanize him, to make the jury show that, you know, he has actually suffered enough. He has faced the severe consequences, and also to kind of question the credibility of law enforcement. But in the end, this wasn't enough. It did not change the outcome of the trial. The defense's team, their main goal was to avoid the death penalty, not exactly to prove his innocence, but ultimately, the jury did find him guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death. After Markeith was sentenced to death in 2018 for the murder of Deborah Clayton, his legal team then began an appeals process. And this is pretty standard in a death penalty case. This is obviously the most severe form of punishment possible. Therefore, the legal system is required to go through the case and review it to make sure that the trial was fair and that the evidence was handled correctly. Also, because there were some, issues with his arrest and the fact that he killed a police officer, and like some people took that quite personally, and he was pretty much beaten up during that process. They had to make sure everything was fair and balanced. So during Markeith's appeal, his defense team didn't really try to retry the case. They instead were looking for legal errors, whether the jury was selected properly, was evidence handled properly, were his rights violated at any point. And the case was reviewed by the Florida Supreme Court. And in November of 2023, so a couple of years later, this is a really long process that took time, they affirmed the conviction and pretty much said, no, he's still going to be on death row. They didn't find any legal errors of significance, not enough to overturn his case. So the trial was considered valid. Now, this outcome was a relief for so many people. One man put an entire community through so much. Not only were the victims' families affected, but so many people in the surrounding area were. The people who were there that day at the Walmart shooting, who were just going about their day, trying to get groceries, and watched someone get shot and die in front of them. An active police officer in the line of duty, doing her job, trying to, protect people around her. To see someone get shot and killed in that way, that's going to have long lasting impacts on you, as well as for Sade's family. For her brother to nearly die in the process of trying to save his sister, and for her other brother and mother to come and see her on the floor like that, like, I can't imagine the grief and trauma that they all had to go through. So, Markeith finally getting a conviction was a relief for so many people. During this whole time, many vigils were held for them. They were well-respected members within the community, and not only Sade's family, but people who also knew Deborah spoke very highly of both of them and really wanted to emphasize on the fact that they're more than just tragedies. They're not just victims, they were human beings with lives and a future ahead of them as well. And Sade's death specifically brought awareness to domestic violence and kind of made people realize like how situations can escalate, and it highlighted how people can keep an eye out for the red flags early on. Now, the witness who stood by Deborah's last moment claimed that she cries in her sleep sometimes, and she still has nightmares about the incident. Like, she can't sleep well at night. She's like clearly very traumatized about what happened, but I respect her. Like, to go through something like that and in the moment while everything is going on to still decide to sprint by Deborah's side to stay by her in her last moments, I just really respect that. And in the spot where Deborah was killed in that Walmart parking lot, a lot of people brought flowers there and made it into a really nice memorial and spot to remember her by. Deborah was given an honorary award for bravery. She was given the Purple Heart and the Award of Valor, which is pretty much the highest honor a police officer can receive for their act of bravery. So this was given to Deborah, but obviously she wasn't there to claim it. So her husband, Seth, accepted the honor on her behalf instead. What did you guys think of today's case? This was a lot. There was a lot going on with the manhunt, and it's just so unfortunate that there were 2 victims throughout all of this, 2 trials as well, which I don't think we've done a lot of cases on this channel that had 2 trials ongoing. If you guys have any thoughts, please feel free to leave it down below in the comment section. I would like to know what you guys think about this case. If you guys found this video informative, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will catch you guys in the next one.